Okay, everybody, please welcome Professor Ahmar Mahboob, and he will be giving a presentation today on doing broad positive discourse analysis. This will be a workshop. If you have questions, you may post them to the chat if you like. The professor has said that he is open to taking questions on the fly. So if you would like to interrupt during the stream of the presentation, you can use the hand raising option and then open your microphone to ask a question directly. If so, please do wait for a pause in the presentation so that you do not disrupt the flow. And from here, I'd like to welcome everybody to hear the professor speak. So Professor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I recognize a few names and faces there. Hi, Vicky, and others that I know in the group. So anyway, thank you again, JALT, for inviting me to do these sessions of workshop and the plenary. It's interesting that the workshop actually is preceding the plenary, which is fine. I had planned it the other way around, but it doesn't matter. We can flip it around. That's the whole thing about credible work and kind of work that I'll be talking about. There are really no fixed rules. So it's about getting the job done and getting it done well. So that's what I'll be talking about, really. So in my plenary on Sunday morning, I will spend quite a bit of time talking about what is the credible approach. And actually, in the preview for my session, I've already sort of introduced it and so what that is. But essentially, in a nutshell, the idea is that in the kind of work that we will do with our students and our colleagues and ourselves, at the moment, a lot of the work is focused on reading and writing and doing research papers and writing research reviews or journal article reviews and stuff like that, which is fantastic. But one of the things that I've observed and I've shared in my initial talk and the interview is that when we look around us in the world that we live in, even though we're increasing the number of publications, even the number of journals keep rising every day, and yet at the same time we also observe that things are not really changing in the way that we would like them to. So, for example, poverty is increasing rather than decreasing. The rate of human population growth is exponentially rising. It's not controlled. The environmental issues, the economic issues, it's just all over the place. And when we look at all of these things, we really have to sort of say, wait a second, yes, we understand that all of that stuff is happening and we are not necessarily responsible. Our job is that of a teacher. We're not the ones who are making the policies. That's all okay. Of course, I don't disagree with any of that. But at the same time, we need to realize that any policymaker, any government official, anybody else who gets to be in a position later on in their lives, go through schooling and go through education. So in a sense, the kind of education that we give people, the kind of activities and assignments and projects and all the stuff that we do with our students leads them into being able to do certain things in their future lives or not. It shapes their belief systems to a large degree, the conversations, the discourses that they have, the engagement that they have changes or reinforces what they might already know. So the whole idea about the credible approach is instead of just doing literacy-based work, we need to get our students and ourselves engaged and involved with doing real life projects where we are actually engaged with and creating resources. Now, the key thing that I'll talk about in credible approach is that we want to train our students to create things and make things that don't exist already. And that's the challenge, right? So broad positive discourse analysis is a way in which we move around, in which we plan and conceptualize and think about and then actually develop the material that we need to develop, right? That's the goal of of PDA and broad PDA. I'll actually differentiate in a second what I mean by broad PDA as opposed to a narrow PDA. I'll just talk about it in a second. But just to sort of introduce quickly, what is PDA and what is positive discourse analysis? Now, The key thing is positive discourse analysis is in a sense, you can think it's complementary to critical discourse analysis that most of us are already familiar with. Now, as you would know that in CDA, in critical discourse analysis, typically what we do is we look at a problem or an issue in the society. We look at the texts that are around it. We look at what potential causes might be. We do all that stuff, right? And then we do the analysis and then we write the work. Now, and now that's really good in some ways because it helps us to understand the nature of the problem. It helps us to understand the issues. Yet at the same time, most CDA work leaves us with that discussion of the problems, right? It tells us what the issues are, perhaps in some ways tells us why they might be, but that's where it leaves us. So at the end of the day, most people who do CDA don't actually necessarily have a way of being able to address the concerns that they're raising. So they're raising the concerns, they're explaining the concerns, but they have no way of addressing them. So what it means is that even though we know the problems, we do nothing to address them. And that's part of the reason that the world keeps going the way it is, because we are just talking about stuff and we're not actually doing things in order to impact them or change them. And that's really what we want to do. So what PDA does is instead of looking at problems, we look at positive, successful stories. We look at models where things have happened well. Things have been successful. The goals that people had were achieved by the kind of work that they did. Now, if by learning that, why do we do that? Because by learning and looking at good and successful examples, we can transfer that learning into creating our own material. And remember, that's the key thing about credible. We are creating our material. We don't necessarily have that material that exists. And I'll give you examples of it as we go along. And I'll give you even more examples on Sunday when I talk about the credible approach. But essentially, what we are seeing is that we are creating material, our students are creating material. And again, I'll say this more on Sunday, but just very briefly, it doesn't matter what subject you're teaching. It doesn't matter what grade you're teaching. Of course, you'll have to make adjustments, right? You can't expect to a kindergarten or a primary or a secondary school kid to make the kind of things that perhaps I'll be showing today. But on Sunday, I'll show you things that students can create, even though they might have very limited English language proficiency. They might have very limited understanding of research, all of those things. And yet, as I will demonstrate on and share on Sunday, people, even kids, can do this. Everybody can create things. We have the ability of creating things. The question is, are we actually encouraging that creativity and taking it forward and helping the kids develop their ability to create things in the context where they are, in relation to what they need to do, in relation to a particular set or particular issue or a set of issues that they want to address, where? In their own community. And again, on Sunday, when I give examples, I'll show that. Even today, the examples I'll share will show that. So that's what positive discourse analysis is in a nutshell. It's our ability to look at successful models, understand how those models operate, try to figure out why those models or things. Notice I keep saying things, and that's on purpose because I don't want us to be limited to texts. Texts are not very useful. Things are useful. And as I'll say again on Sunday, but even now again, very briefly, that once people have done the credible projects, which is what they have developed, the things that they have to develop, what you do is you write it up as a report. Now, in my experience, when you actually do write up the report, in with my students, I get zero plagiarism, zero. And that's new because in the past I used to get a lot of plagiarism. Why? Why don't I have it now? Because students are writing from experience. They're not writing based on what they've read or tried to read and can't rephrase in certain ways or don't even necessarily understand, and then they copy and paste. And we know that that's a problem. But in doing credible projects and doing positive discourse analysis, there's no way you can do that because there is no model answers. There is no quotation you can copy and paste. It's based on your personal experience. It's based on what you did. Now, and something that I often say, you cannot plagiarize experience. You can plagiarize other people's texts, but you can't plagiarize experience. Experience is something you have. And then the report that you write based on what you have done is based on what you have done. And that's the key thing. So as you will see throughout today and also on Sunday, that we're actually really integrating all the various types of language, but beyond language skills. And this is really important that PDA, especially broad PDA, goes beyond language. Because language is just one of the semiotic systems or one of the ways in which we make meaning. There are multiple other ways through which we do it. So as I said, there are multiple types of PDA. One that is what used to exist before I sort of opted to extend it and expand in a different way is based on what my colleague Jim Martin developed early, about 10 or 15 years ago, the notion of a narrow PDA, where essentially what you do is you take model texts that are really good, texts that are really successful, texts that have achieved their purpose really well, and then you do a close linguistic and text analysis to understand how the text works. And notice, because I said that credible approach is about doing things and making things, when you make things, yeah, of course, language is important in the development of the material, but the final product that you make may have no language at all. And again, I'll share some examples of this on Sunday. So the products don't have language necessarily because you don't always need it. There are other ways of communicating meaning and making people understand things which are not restricted to language. And that's really important for us to know and realize. And therefore, what I do in broad PDA is I get out of that restriction and limitation to language. And I move beyond that to our sensory systems. And through an understanding of the sensory systems and a reconciliation of how different modalities and different ways of creating meaning and things relate to the sensory systems, we can then move into doing an analysis of things. And once we have learned doing the analysis, we can transition and change that into making things. And that's the really important thing. So the goals of broad PDA are essentially two. The first is analyzing examples of successful projects. And two, using what we have learned to create new projects, right? So all your analysis is always focused not just on the thing, but as we know, analysis is almost always subjective. Even if you've got technical terms and things, there's a lot of subjectivity in kinds of analysis that we do. So we recognize that and we are aware of it, and we actually take it as a good thing, because our understanding of the context where we are, our participation in the community for which we are developing material and resources really allows us to draw on the kind of, focus on things that are successful, but then analyze them in relation to how we want to use them, and then translate that analysis into the products. And once you've done your product, once you've created everything, that's when you write up your project report, right? So as I said, we are going to work through sensory systems, not language. In fact, I find in many cases, language description and grammars are pretty useless in the kind of work we're doing. And for most part of my work, I just ignore grammar and language altogether, unless, of course, it becomes a necessary aspect of the project, in which case, of course, we do focus on it. So the focus of PDA is based on your goals, and your goal is to actually create material, not just analyze stuff for the sake of analysis. So again, in terms of application, whether it is in a high school, getting students to look at good examples of things and help them understand how to analyze them. And once they have analyzed them multiple times, different things, then you can transition them into making things. And we'll talk about that again. Again, as Steve said earlier on, please do feel free to just raise your hand if you've got a question, and I will be happy to pause and respond to your questions, because I do realize that some of the things that I'll be talking about are not necessarily common knowledge, and it's not necessarily stuff that you would read about because people haven't been writing about it. So do feel free to stop me at any time you would like. So moving on then, and really sort of moving from here to developing our understanding of the sensory systems. And this is really crucial. I will take a few minutes to talk through this. I realize it will take a bit of time from our session, but we need to get to know this really well. It's not complex at all. Now, essentially what I'm saying here is let's understand our sensory systems. We all learned as children, maybe even before we ever went to school, that we have 5 senses. We have sight, we have sound, we have smell, we have touch, we have taste. Again, I always tell people, not everybody has every sense. That doesn't matter. If people are missing a sensory system, that's fine, because even if you have it, we don't all use our sensory systems the same way. And this is really interesting. Again, we don't always think about it this way, but simply think about it is like, I've got a big nose, right? You can see that. I'll take my glasses off. You see my big nose, right? Now, if I've got a big nose, what does that mean? It means that the way that I will see through my eyes, even if it's the other person is the same height as me, but if they've got a different nose, their field of vision will be different. Yes, so we have sight. We both have sight, but our field of vision is different. And that's extremely important to remember, that pretty much everybody has differences in the sensory systems that they use. They're not identical. Simply because 2 people have eyes doesn't mean they see the same things. We know that. I live in the bush. And actually, the reason I'm actually in a motorhome today, because it's really hot outside and my laptop stops working if it gets really hot. But the reason I'm saying that is I'll just show you quickly outside, if I don't know if you can see it, but you can probably see the forest and the bush. Now, when I started living in the bush a couple of years ago, one of the things I realized that even though I knew the trees existed, I could see trees when I was driving through places. It wasn't until I actually started living in the bush that I actually started to observe and realize that how different the trees are. It's like every day I live in the same forest, I see new trees. Now, they're not new trees. The trees have been there before. It's my eyesight that is being trained to identify them now. As opposed to an indigenous person, an Aboriginal person from this region who will not have that problem. They will be able to scan that place and be able to identify things that I don't even see right now. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this, that people think that it's simply because some people don't have sight that there's a shift. No, you can have sight and yet things will still be different. The same thing with sound, same thing with smell, touch, and taste. Think of touch. Again, you can't touch my skin because we are on the internet, but I'll show you. You can probably see how my hands are hard and rough, and they've always been like that. I remember being teased in a school, in primary school, by other kids who told me that I had hands like a worker's or a laborer's hand, and I've always had that. Now, that means that if you look at touch, if you've got soft hands with a lot of nerves, you can touch and feel things. I can't. I just have a limitation. It's a physical limitation I have that we don't always think about. But there is advantages of it as well. It's not only disadvantageous. There are lots of advantages. For example, I love cooking, and I can do things with my hands in cooking that other people cannot because their hands get burned. And I have a very high tolerance to heat, especially my hands. I can touch stuff and pick stuff out from a frying pan if I need to. Imagine that. That's crazy. But I can do it because of the way that my hands are. Other people can't. Again, just trying to explain and illustrate that simply because we have the same sensory systems does not mean that we use them in the same way. They have the same configurations. And even if it did, it doesn't mean that we will interpret the stuff in the same way, right? Even so, for example, I might cook something and might love it, but you might not like it because you have a different taste bud, right? You have a different experience. You have a different way of experiencing taste. So I love it, but you don't love it. You might even hate it, or you might like it, but others don't, right? Why? The taste is the same, right? If you do a chemical analysis, it's the same stuff. But again, our experiences of who we are, where we come from, help us interpret all of these things and put them together, right? Notice, as a human being, we are working, we're living our every second of our life through all the sensory systems that we have. It doesn't matter if it's 5 or 4 or 3, doesn't matter. In fact, I'll tell you something. I don't know if you guys, some of you might have, if you've met somebody who doesn't have a sense of smell, zero smell. Now, I've not really met anybody like that until very recently. Some of my family, adopted family here, took me out to the bush, to a place called Pasco River, where I met another guy who quite old, and he showed me that he was back in 1994, so that's 26 years ago, when he was a young guy. He was doing something, and a horse hit his nose, and his nose broke. So his nose bone right here broke, which meant from 1994 onwards, this guy cannot smell. Now, we might not realize this. I didn't really realize it, but we use smell so constantly all the time to make decisions and think around things. But this guy who lost the sense of smell can't even tell the difference if this glass here is water or if it's gasoline. He can't tell because the color is not different, and he cannot smell. He can't smell. There's no smell for him. So imagine a person who can't smell, right? Again, all of these things come together. Now, notice language, primarily language is just spoken, right? It's spoken, it's what we say. Now, when we convert the spoken into a visual system, then one of the options, remember, only one of the options, there are multiple options. One of the options to convert our oral language or linguistic meaning into a visual form is to do a transcription using scribbles, or what we call writing systems, right? So writing systems is what leads us to literacy, right? So literacy is about our ability to read and write. Now notice, literacy operates through sight. Language, what I call Boli here, Boli is oral language, operates through sounds. Now I put these sight and sound into group A, and then the other 3 senses into group B. Why? Because of a very fascinating difference. Now notice, this presentation is only possible because sight and sound can be recorded or transmitted to a place where it is no longer present. Does it make sense? Think about it this way. We are all in the same present time. Even if the time zones are different, we are all present right now. We are all engaged in the same thing, right? This presentation, this workshop, right? You can see me. I can sometimes see some of you. If I ask you to turn on your cameras, I can probably see all of you. But that doesn't mean you can see what I can see. And that doesn't mean I can see what you can see. Not because we are the same people, but because we are not sharing the physical space. We are not present in each other's company. That's the fascinating thing. You can record sight and sound, like this session is being recorded, and people will listen to it later, and they can listen to it. But when they listen to a recording, I'm not even doing it at that time. I might be doing something else altogether, right? But they will be watching it. Notice, what they're watching is not happening in the present. And even though this session is happening in the present for those present here, we don't have the same physical space. Therefore, I cannot see what's around you, and you cannot see what's around me. Now, when that happens, when we move into a place where you cannot see what I can see and I cannot see what you can see, then the only way for us to be able to succeed and engage with each other successfully is through being able to trust each other, right? So if I tell you that I've got a mug of coffee sitting next to me, you can't tell if I do or not, because you're not present in my physical space. But if you were present in my physical space, then you would know. And I can show you now. I do have a cup of coffee. I don't want to spill it, but it is coffee. Now you will have to trust me. Maybe you can even see it. It's black, no sugar. That's the way I like it, right? So you can see, I showed it to you. I will drink it to demonstrate that it is coffee. And it's not poison, and it's not gasoline in case you things, right? Notice again what's happening. Things that are not in the present have to be trusted. Things that are in the present are observational. When things are observational, it means that if you observe something and it doesn't make sense to you, or if you think there's something odd, you will question it. But when you remove things away from your present and things are no longer observable, then it is 100% about your belief and your trust in the text or the thing. Now, notice that can only happen with group A. With group B, it can't happen. So for example, I just had this coffee, right? Now, some of you might like coffee, some of you might like tea, some of you might like neither of them, something else. Who knows what you like, right? But let's say whatever it is that you like. If it's not in present of you, like the coffee is in present of me, you can't taste it. I can smell it. I can actually touch the coffee here. See, you can see it. I just touched the coffee and I can taste the coffee. I just tasted it. You can't do it. You cannot do that. Why? Because the coffee or whatever it is not in front of you. It's not in your presence. So if something is not in your presence for group B, you cannot experience it at all. You can imagine it. Yeah, I can imagine the kind of food I had in Japan when I was there last time, right? I can imagine all of those things. I can imagine the smell of the city, right? I can sense the feel of the cold air. I can remember it, but I can't actually feel it. It's not a feeling I have, because for me to feel that taste or the touch or smell or the cold, things have to be in the present. That's an extremely crucial distinction. And notice, we live our lives through all the sensory systems we have together all the time. Now, unfortunately, because of various historical elements that we don't need to talk about or worry about anymore, it's all in the past, so it doesn't matter. But we have created an educational system that focuses primarily on literacy, on ability to read and write. Notice that's only sight. And we do it through speaking and lectures and things, which is sound. Notice how most of our education, not all, of course, there are exceptions, most of our education is based on group A, which means it's about trust. It's not about observation. And that's why, as I started off, I was saying, we can see that we're creating all this knowledge, we're writing all these papers, but things around us don't change. In fact, they get worse. Why? Because we're stuck in things that are not observable. We are reading and writing stuff that's not within our observation. It's not based on experience. It's not based on being able to see or touch or do. It's based on readings about things that are not present and not observable. And therefore, we don't actually ever know if there is any truth in any of it. We don't, because it's not observable. And that's a trap. And that's, in a sense, is a problem, because when we build our sense and our knowledge and our understanding of the world primarily on just things that we read and hear, things that are not in our present and in our observation, guess what? If those things are not right, then we are tricked. And if we are tricked from our childhood onwards, we are doomed. And perhaps that's part of what the history has been, right? But as we move in today's session and on Sunday, I want us to realize that we can change all of it. It doesn't need to be the same way, because as teachers, we have a lot of agency. Yeah, we have to complete a curriculum, but the curriculum is easy if it's only based on literacy and oral stuff. That's not that complex. What's complex is all the putting everything together. And actually, it's not complex. What you will realize through this session is that actually language learning and language teaching becomes easier through a credible approach, because you're basing things on experience, not on abstractions. No abstractions at all. Everything is concrete, physical, embodied, present. I understand that that's a challenge, especially given the world that we live in today, with all the COVID-19 stuff and the online sessions. I'm sure if it wasn't a COVID-19, I would probably have been in Japan physically in the same space as you. But we know that because of what's happening over the last few months, that's changed. Imagine then all of these kids around the world who are now getting educated, not even in the physical space which is shared, but in a remote space, there's no sharing at all. Now, it is especially in this context, I mean, even in the regular context, but especially in this particular time, that we have to really think about how do we create projects and assignments and activities that get the students to be mobilized in where they are, because that's how kids and people learn and engage with things and do things. How do we get that? And that's really important. How do we move beyond just sight and sound? That's the tricky thing that we need to learn. Again, as I said, it's not that hard, especially when we're doing PDA. Because once you sort of understand this, before I move on, any questions? I'll just pause for a second or two, and if there's a question that you would like me to address at this time, I'm happy to take it before I move in to the next sort of set of slides.
Professor, I'll jump in if you don't
Sure,
mind.
Sure.
You talk about the sensory separation, and I think it's a really good point with the COVID right now. What about digital engagement with students creating things online versus, for example, hands in the dirt, in the soil? But what about digital engagement?
That's what we'll have to do, right? We'll have to kind of do engagement of certain, as long as people are doing things, right? People doing things, creating things. And that's the key thing, creating things, making things and creating things is you're fully engaged. You're thinking about everything. And that's where I want our training to move into. So when we are training our students to make these things, we want them to be sensitized, not just to language and sound of language, but the whole context of everything around it. So that's where the PDA comes in, right? So remember, for PDA to work, we take a positive example, an example that has been effective, and then we analyze it. And how do we analyze it? We analyze it, through first just putting up like a big sort of a broad sort of a thing. What are we analyzing? Like describing it, where was it part of a larger campaign? All those sort of generic questions. This is just giving context of what it is that's being done. But that's not the key thing. The key thing is this slide, the next slide here. This is the key. This is the key for broad PDA. Now, getting people to learn, what are they seeing? Describe what you're seeing. Notice, they have to describe what they're seeing. And that what meanings are being projected. Again, if you're working with school kids, change the language, make it easy. I work mostly with postgraduate students or other people who are highly educated in general. So I can use the word projected. But if you're working with a different audience, change these things. These are not set in stone at all. But the key idea is getting people to say, all right, here's something that I'll show you. Tell me what you see in this stuff. If there are any sounds or any references to sound, because a lot of times, especially in today's world, when we are dealing with screens, the sound necessarily does not always have to come with something that you can hear, but it can be visualized, right? So for example, a sign of a music, all that stuff, that can happen. So this is the key thing. Now, let me show you how this operates. Let me give you a few examples. Now, this first example is first and second and first two examples are actually taken from my PhD student Aurelie's work, where she's been looking at this particular series of, it's actually a whole campaign of anti-tobacco campaign in Australia. Now, why did we choose an anti-tobacco campaign? Because what we want to do, and why we're doing this essentially, is we want to create an anti-sugar campaign. That's our goal. Right? Remember, there's two elements, right, to broad PDA. One is the analysis of a successful model, and the second is trying to create things. So our goal is actually to create an anti-sugar campaign. Why anti-sugar? Because we know sugar is probably the most addictive of any drugs ever. And there is no legislation around this drug. There is no age limit or age restrictions to this access to this drug. Anybody can access this drug in any quantity, right? And it's evil. We know type 2 diabetes is a consequence of sugar intake in your early childhood. And again, in the community I'm living in here, in the indigenous communities, almost everybody, as they get into the 30s and 40s, gets diabetes type 2. Why? Because the sugar consumption is so high, and there is no control of it. The government doesn't care, because actually the farming in Australia is largely sugarcane farming. Sugarcane farming is a big thing in Australia, especially in Queensland, where I am at the moment. right? So of course, the farming and the industry is one that is so powerful that the government doesn't want to create any anti-sugar laws or regulations. So in a sense, then we know that the politics are whatever they are, but at the same time, we know what the problems are. We don't need to do a CDA to understand it. We know, we can see it observationally. We know what's happening. So as teachers, we can take it upon ourselves to sensitize our students and to get them to create material that is anti-sugar campaign material. And I've had students do it already in a couple of my classes, and I'm still working on it. And we're going to create more of it. And I would invite you guys to join us, because sugar is a global problem. Anywhere in the world, sugar is a problem. In fact, if you guys know the history of colonization, you will realize sugar was one of the main reasons why Western colonization even took place. It was the desire to get sugar because Northern European climates could not produce sugarcane. That's why, for example, all of the Caribbean, Philippines, all of these areas that were colonized became sugarcane plantations, including Queensland. So, of course, given the tie of sugar with colonization, we know that's not, an anti-sugar campaign is not something that's very likely in the near future. But we are also cognizant that sugar is a poison. It's a drug. It's an addictive drug. It rots kids' teeth. You've seen that. I see it here all the time. A three and a half, 4-year-old kid out on the street playing on bike. I go and sit down and have a play with them. And as they're talking and playing with me, I see their teeth are all rotten. They're black, they're broken. This is a 3.5, 4-year-old kid. The screen here that you see about the tobacco, that's an old guy, right? Whatever the age is, age 50. Kids who are 4-year-old, 3.5-year-old have worse teeth than that. Yes, you can say that, of course, those teeth will fall off. Guess what? Yeah, they will, but the new ones will be just as bad. And the other thing we don't realize is your dental hygiene is directly related to your cardiovascular hygiene, health. So if your teeth are bad, if your mouth is rotten, your heart is getting weaker. And if your heart is getting weaker from an age of 3.5, by the time you're 40, 50, your heart is done, you're dead. And guess what? That's exactly what's happening in the indigenous communities and poor countries. Life expectancy is low and it is dropping, which is odd, right? So if you see in the advanced world, Japan specifically has a very high life expectancy. But if you look at the Aboriginal communities, the life expectancy is probably half of that. Why? They're the same human beings. It's because of a number of things, but sugar is a key issue. Sugar is more probably dangerous than tobacco, I argue, because you don't start smoking until you're at least a teenager, perhaps even later. But sugar, in some cases, again, I've seen it in the poor developing countries. I've seen it here. You know, kids who are 1, 2 years old, their parents put heap full of sugar in milk. They take milk, which is already has sugar. They add sugar to the milk and mix it up and give it to the kids. That's the level of sugar that these kids take. Instead of water, a lot of people drink Coke. You know that. Now, we need to create that campaign. That's our goal. Now, to do that, if we want to create a good campaign, even though we won't have the resources that the government has had to create this anti-tobacco campaign, even if we don't, we know that the anti-tobacco campaign has been really useful. It has been effective. Why? Because the rate of smoking has decreased in Australia. People don't pick up smoking until they are at least, I think now 15, 16, 17, something like that. It used to be 12, 13. So that's changed, right? That's not a bad thing. So younger kids are not smoking as much, picking up smoking earlier. And there's been a drop in overall tobacco consumption in the country. So that's a good thing. So that means that the Australian tobacco campaign has been a successful campaign. Now, because it's a successful campaign, we can use that as an example for our PDA, our broad positive discourse analysis. And notice, as soon as you see the images, you realize, even here, just the little image I've shown you, that, hey, this is not just text. You can just see how sight, the disgusting teeth, that is really what's working on us, right? It's not the smoking damages your gums and teeth. It's the visual image of those dirty teeth. I don't want to see them, right? That's what hurts you, right? Notice how image is sometimes very powerful. And then, of course, it's co-articulated with text. But notice image can operate without the text, which means a person who has low or no literacy can still see the images and understand what they mean without the text. And that's why I said to you, in the kind of material that you want to get yourself or your students to produce, you don't have to use language in the material you produced. Of course, there's a lot of language in the way towards producing the material, and then, of course, in the write-up, but the material itself doesn't need it. And that's really important. And again, using all the different references and things. So what I've shared here is just essentially a broad, and sort of just filling out the stuff that I told you in that form. It just gives you a bit of a context if you don't know the context. But the key thing, as I said, is this stuff, right? Notice here, what we're doing is we're looking at things like sight, sound, smell, touch, taste. Oh, sorry. Oh, so sight, there we can see there are headings. We can see the black background on the front of the pack and the red background on the back of the pack create a contrast with the white headings. This immediately draws the smoker's gaze to the heading, right? So they see the contrast in the colors. The contrast in the colors shift your gaze. Notice the choice of colors. Notice the image and the language within the whole thing. Notice language is just playing one part. It's not the whole thing. And because we are learning to make things, we need to look beyond just language in our gaze, in our training, in how we approach things, right? And now we also look that there are aspects of sound, right? There's a quit line number in a box, which is a quotational box, right? So the image and the sound is not, of course, the box doesn't have a sound, right? But it gives you that sense of that verbalization or vocalization. So again, image is used for it. Now notice it's a box. You don't get a smell from a box necessarily. Of course you can, but notice again, the word smoking can itself smoke, right? So there's a metaphorical use of smell. This is extremely important, as somebody was, as an earlier question as well, when we're dealing with online stuff and we're just looking at single, like just text or images or stuff that is two-dimensional. We don't necessarily have the smell, but we can evoke a sense of smell, right? We can evoke a sense of smell. For example, the letter Q in the quit line. Notice the Q. I wish I'd grown this up a bit bigger for you as well. But if you look at the Q, the way that the Q is shaped gives you again an association with the smells, right? And of course, in terms of taste, this one is very graphic. The damage to the gums means taste is not good, right? Again, notice taste and smell and touch are not, because they have to be in present. They can't operate on the non-present. Therefore, you can only deal with them metaphorically in this context. But in other contexts, it's not the case. In other contexts, you can actually integrate them within your work. But when you're producing texts, then sometimes you can't. I'm just looking at a question. How do you avoid correlation causation issues with PDA? Being thorough. We don't even deal with those questions. We're not looking at correlations. Notice there is no statistical analysis anywhere. We're not looking at causation, and we're just looking at what is. And we're trying to analyze it from our own perspective. I understand that not everybody's perspective is the same. That's fine. We want that diversity of variations of opinions and interpretations. And that's where you can create discussions and group works where you can create some consensus around how you see and interpret these images. And again, you will realize as you start working on this stuff yourself and get your students to do it, it will take a bit of experience and experimenting to sort of get this all right, but it's not difficult, because guess what? There is not much technicality here, right? We're using very commonsensical terms, and I'm doing it deliberately because when we work out in the real world, not everybody is sophisticated and has the terminology and the technical terms that we want them to have in, say, a course on linguistics or language. They don't have that. Most people don't know what a passive is or an subjunctive is. They don't even need to know that, right? Of course, we teachers, we need to know, but they don't need to know that. So again, when we're creating this stuff, we're creating the idea of these things, we want to be able to be as accessible to people as we can, which means that the work that I'm doing, yeah, there is technicality, but I'm actually the outward sort of aspect of all the PDA and credible approach is always non-technical, everyday language, commonsensical world. Why? Because we want anybody to be able to engage with it, not just people who have high training, right? Isn't that what's happening now? So if you, for example, want to read something about sugar and something, you'll have to read technical stuff. Now, if you do technical stuff, if you have the ability to read technical stuff, that's great. But if you don't have the ability to read the technical stuff, if you haven't been initiated into the discipline or to the field, you're totally lost. You can't do it, right? But if you are using commonsensical, experiential ways of engaging with people, then it just totally changes because you can actually work with everybody. You're not stuck with all that stuff. You don't have to talk about passive and active and all this stuff. You talk about what's happening, right? So, for example, in this sentence, smoking damages your gum and teeth, right? Notice we can do a structural analysis, we can do a linguistic analysis, but we don't need to. We can talk about how when you're trying to when you're trying to warn somebody about something, what do you say first? First thing you tell them is the warning, right? So you say, water, watch out, or watch out, water, or something. Here it is, smoking. That's the first thing. And notice you don't do it with grammatical analysis. You do it with the goal of what's being done. So you do it with an understanding of the purpose. Purpose drives it. Purpose drives not just language, which is what genre pedagogy is all about, but purpose drives all our sensory systems in terms of their interpretations and also in terms of creations. Now, let me just pause here. I've got a question here. Why do you think the images wouldn't conjure images of the feel of eating food? I think I said, yeah, you can. I think I said, yes, you can conjure. That's what it is all about. It's metaphorical, right? It is conjuring. It's metaphorical. You can see the teeth. It's visible. It's not observable because it's not in your presence, but it's still visible through your sight. But taste is not. You can't taste it. It evokes. It's a conjuration, right? So that's what I mean. It's not wouldn't. It's actually would. Text and images conjure these things. That's why, for example, literature, poetry, you read something and you can imagine and you can taste and you can feel. Why? Because you're reading it. But notice that it's all conjuring. It's your internal imagination that's working. It's not the real taste happening at that time, right?
Yep. Professor,
So,
if I could, I think the question that Kato was raising there was that you specifically have touch as not applicable. And I think the point that this person's trying to make is that your tongue is also touch. Because I know looking at this image, my tongue immediately went to my teeth to feel, to see. My teeth aren't that bad, right?
Perfect.
So the tongue is touch as well.
Absolutely. Tongue is touch and taste, right? Again, I didn't go into all the details about the sensory systems because then we will just spend the whole time talking about them. But we also know, for example, that people actually, there's synesthesia. So, for example, every time a person smells something, they see a color, right? I have a friend that when they read, the text is never black and white. It's always multicolored depending on what it is. So people see color where it's not, right, in terms of making sense of things. So we know that the sensory systems are actually very complex, and I know that we're using them very simplistically in some ways. But that's, again, it's a purpose, right? We don't want to go into all the nitty-gritties when we want to use something practical and get it done, right? Because if we get into the details, then we will again get back into the trap of reference-based thinking, writing up, reading, and that stuff. We're not doing things anymore. And the key things is doing things, right? So now, if we move again, I agree with you that touch, and you can probably even evoke sense of touch, perhaps not as much from this particular image, but from others. But yeah, again, people will have different interpretations, and that's good because you want that conversation to happen. This could even be a group activity where people interpret and talk about things in different ways. Now, I'll just share another quick example with you, and I won't go into the whole analysis, but notice quick for one, quick for two. This time you can see that smoking sign as well. Notice again the choice of colors, the choice of a pregnant woman, how the associations are happening. There's also the text. There is the choice of colors, the pink, the light pink, all of that stuff's happening together, right? And again, we can analyze this in detail. I won't go into the deep analysis. Again, this is just going through the images, a quick sort of, you can train your students to do this kind of work within an hour or two at the most, even not if you need that much time. They don't even need this much time because our sensory systems are always there, right? So the key thing is teaching them how to take the description and turn that into an interpretation. And that's really important because you're actually teaching them a lot by teaching them that. But now, as I said, one aspect of PDA is just about analyzing things. We analyze things. But the key thing really is about developing material, right? So what we do then is we move from what we have been doing to moving into designing things, PDA for designing things. What you do is again, sort of a broad thing of what do you want to do? What is your goal? Are you going to do multiple things? Blah, blah, blah. And then for each thing, you're sort of thinking of creating. What will you create? How will you use different, you will sight? Will you use sound? Will you use smell, touch, and taste? Will these be metaphorical or will they be in real, in person? All of those things. What kind of meanings do you want to project from the use of all of these things? Getting people to think about these things, about the material they want to create. And once they've sort of done that, then you go through it, you talk with them, you give them feedback, they do a draft. You go through this multiple times and you use the tables, the little tables there, both for planning and both for feedback. I use it to give feedback on the draft. So once a student gives me a draft poster, I use this to, in a sense, give them feedback of how they are doing things and how perhaps they need to expand it. Perhaps how some of the interpretations that they were expecting are not being fulfilled. How do they need to change it? Again, that's all engagement and work we do with them. Right. Now, I again give you an example of something that I've made my students do. Again, remember, we've been talking about tobacco a lot and smoking. So one of once we've done this first sort of, exemplification of the Australian thing, I give them this little task. I'd ask them, can you design a cigarette butt disposal, which should encourage smokers to throw away the cigarette butts properly, but at the same time, it should not encourage smoking. Now, that's a challenge. You want an ashtray or a cigarette butt disposal, but you also want to discourage people at the same time. So the students, it's a really challenging question. Now, so the students started drafting things and I started looking at it. So one of the groups came up with this draft where they talked about what they're trying to do, dirty lung versus clear lung, which gives you a sense of smoking makes our lungs dirty, right? So things like smells, touch, and things like that, what they were expecting to do. I gave them feedback, and then they came up with this beautiful design, which we haven't taken it further, but I think this is actually a really good design, and I would love to actually see it in being made and put into public places, right? So people don't throw their butts everywhere. I know Japan, you don't necessarily have that problem as much anymore, but in other parts of the world, it still exists. So, or even in Japan, where you've got the public smoking areas, you put this kind of a disposal instead of the traditional kinds, where what's essentially happening, notice in the design, is they have a clear plastic and they put a lock, they've put the seal here. So all the butts will be going in here. The other side here will never have any cigarettes. It will always remain clean, which means that once lung is dirty, the other is clean. That contrast is so visible and it is so disturbing, and it is right physically in front of you. No, it's not even an image on a packet of a cigarette. It's something, it's in your observation. You can see it. Now that's a design, right? So fantastic design. I hope that we can create it one day. But this is just a thing that I do as an activity with the students towards moving them into what they will actually eventually do in their real projects. But you can get a sense of how the PDA works together to create this possibility. Now, I know that we are running out of time, but you guys all have your PowerPoints anyway. I just wanted to give you a bit of activities. Here's another example of what I call a credible project. It's from the Philippines, and this is designed by young people. I don't remember the details, but the guy who designed it is probably early 20s at the most. So what he designed, because he lives out in the country, and there's a lot of trash, but in Philippines, people love basketball. So what they did, he designed this and worked with but the council and the local council, and they created this free throw plastic bottles. So it's like a basketball net, and you're taking this activity, right? Notice you're getting rid of the garbage, but you're making it fun. It's kinesthetic. It's all of that together. It's a fantastic idea. And I love this particular design. I mean, there are things you can improve, of course, but it's a great conception, right? And again, credible projects, I keep telling people, they don't always have to come from academics. We see them all over the place. There's a question about PBL. My work on credible approach is not PBL. It's not project-based learning. It's something very different. I'll talk about it on Sunday more, because today we are sort of talking more about how you actually do the project. So that gives you a sense of it's project-based. It's actually not project-based. It's based on sensory systems, and it's based off a notion of credibility, which is quite different. Again, we'll talk about that, I think, on Sunday more. But again, you guys can do this activity on your own. And there's another one. This is actually something that my partner Mona sort of created with her team of people she had been working with in the Philippines. It's Filipino here, but again, you can see the design. It's designed for a Wawa Dam cleanup project, because not very clean. There's not a lot of bins. But again, using the sensory systems. Again, what I would like you to do is, even if you don't understand the language, forget the language. Just look at what's happening in terms of sight and sound and smell. Just look at the colors and the images. You see the stop sign, and what you see in the stop sign, and the water flooding through. And of course, if you are from the Philippines and from the region, you will realize there is a lot of sort of history and sort of other stuff going on here as well. As I said, context is always very important. Knowledge of context is extremely important. And this is something I'll stress on Sunday when I talk about how, when we're creating credible projects, it's context and understanding of local knowledge that drives the project more than anything else. Yes, that's right. Thanks, Jason. That is exactly right. Now, because you're a Filipino, I guess you can translate it. Now, also that this is, what are they called? What lines are they called? The word is going away from my name.
Pickup lines. Pickup lines, I'd say. Pickup lines. These are like pickup lines.
They're pickup lines. Bugot, tugot lines. There's a word for it, a Filipino word. Hugot line.
Hugot,
Right? Hugot.
Like
Hugot
inspiration.
Yeah, Hugot is the Filipino term for it. It's fantastic. Notice why they did it. They did it because a lot of people in the Wawa Dam area are young people who are going hiking. So they used a phrase which would resonate with the youth, and sort of be funny as well in a sense, right? So creating a bit of humor as well in a very difficult sort of a bleak sort of an environment. So anyway, notice how all of these things can be done. Now, again, you can do your analysis, but remember the key thing with PDA is not just doing the multi-sensory. I don't call it multimodal. In fact, multimodal is a misnomer, and I'll talk about it perhaps on Sunday. In brief, it's a misnomer because notice that its sensory systems cannot, when you have different sensory systems, modes exist within a sensory system, not across sensory systems. So what I mean by that is that writing and speaking are not two modes of language. They are two different sensory systems. Writing and drawing and performance, physical performance, dance, they are all visual. They are all modes of your visual system. And so there's a bit of a thing around those, but do keep that in mind. And remember that what we're doing here is not just using the multiple sensory systems to understand how good things are done, positive things are done, but we are doing it for a purpose. And the purpose is to create our own material, create the material, create the things that don't exist in the world at the moment, create them. And if we can teach our students to create and make things, then they can keep creating and making their whole lives. And they won't be stuck and compromised by literacies in the way that many of us have been. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody. I know that I've been talking more than I should have spend time for questions, but that's why I love having interruptions and questions in the middle of the talk as well. But I'm just going to stop here and let you guys, if there are any other questions that you would like to ask at all.
At this point, I would just like to add that we have reached the end of the session. So if possible, I'd like everybody just to open up your mics and just a round of applause for the professor, because I think this is a very interesting presentation about sensories and perceptions and how we all do see things differently and how we need to, work towards developing these things. So a round of applause for the professor, please.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sir Ahmar.
Thank you so much.
Very, very, very interesting. And I look forward to your presentation later in the seminar, later in the conference. At this point, thank you very much. So at this point, we'll leave the room open if you want to stay in discussion, but at this point, I'll end the recording so that we can officially end